Hello, everyone. My name is Derek Cameron. I work in the Code Innovate team along with Stephen Nichols and others. And today I'll be showing you how to use OAC to build visualizations on data in enterprise planning and budgeting. Check out the Code Innovate team. We build solutions to your use cases in a compressed time frame. We facilitate rapid knowledge sharing. Check it out. The program's been very, very popular. So let's get started. Today I'll be covering understanding multidimensional data. Multidimensional data is quite different than relational data, which was much more common. Often users get frustrated and have challenges accessing multidimensional data. So I'll cover that, some of the concepts that are explain why those challenges persist. I will show you how to connect to EPBCS using OAC direct connections. We'll show you how to create models in OAC Classic RPD so that we can extend functionality and do a lot more on the Classic side than on the DV side in certain situations when building dashboards. And finally, I'll be showing you how to build visualizations, what they look like, and how you can work with those EPB data sources most effectively. So let's get started. So let's start by logging into EPM Cloud, and let's take a look at the application data. Now you can actually take a look at it in its flattened form by exporting that data out of the cube. But let's log in and take a look at it. You can access that application data, the cube data, by going into the application main menu and then going to overview. So we'll open that up. You'll notice that there is a Cubes tab here. If you select the Cubes tab, we're going to be working with OAPFS, the financial data. It's in this application here. You'll also notice there's dimensions as well. So let's select our OAPFS link there, and you'll notice that it's got account, period, plan, element, product, market, etc. Now, the important thing to understand is that we think of these, at least I do, like tables. There's the account table, the period table, plan, element table, etc. They're dimensions in a cube. Some of these members are additive and some are not. So, for example, you have different versions. Well, it doesn't make sense to add up the different versions. In a relational world, you would need to know that rule, because if you didn't put a filter on version, you would have multiple versions, and the versions would have data that would typically add up and not make any sense at all. So it's really up to you to understand what those rules are and to be able to query that data and apply the filters and logic so that you come up with meaningful results. The enterprise planning and budgeting application enforces that rule. So if you select members from all of these dimensions and fact data, if you don't put a query on it, a filter on each one of these, you'll get no data back. And that's really part of the frustration. You'll have to know that, for example, product is additive. You don't have to worry about a filter on product. Most of these, think of it a bit like radio buttons on your filters. They're either or, they're not. They're typically, you just have to understand where that data is and how to fetch that when we pull it into OAC. Now, there's a couple of ways to understand that. There's really three ways that I see. One, you can talk to the customer, talk to the folks that manage that cube and ask them. That might not seem too efficient. You can also export that data out. And so you can do that by simply going to Actions, Export Data, and then export that data out and then take a look at the raw flattened data. Well, what does that look like? I've exported it out. It looks like this. The account is in the first column, and then the period is across different columns, one column for each value. And then we have what's called a point of view, and you'll see this in SmartView, the point of view, which is really the filters on all the other dimensions combined. And so if you scroll down here, you'll see some combinations have more data than others. But what you could do is take this account, for example, a row here, this account for that period up here, and then go back to the point of view and take it, select OFS CAPEX, total product, no market, OAP. So this is pretty tedious, but I'm just showing you what it actually looks like when it's flattened out and where to find the data. The data's here, there's no data here. It's a bit like Swiss cheese, right? So, and cubes typically could end up, if you're exporting these cubes out, they could end up being very, very large. In this case, this is really quite a small cube, and the flattened version comes out to some 165,000 rows. So we're not going to use this. We're actually going to go into SmartView. So let's take a look at SmartView now. I'll open an Excel spreadsheet. SmartView is a plugin to Excel. I've created a document here. We'll take a look at that. So when we get started, this is a report that I'd pulled out of the EPM repository. It's a saved SmartView report, but to access this, you go into the SmartView menu here. If I select the panel, you'll notice here on the right-hand side, you've got shared connections and private connections. I have created a private connection to my EPM instance. I select private connections. I could select the arrow down, and the connection is this one right here. It's the server name running on port 9000, Hyperion Planning SmartView. So let's select that. And it's going to prompt me to log in. I'll do that now. We'll log in. And at this point, we can navigate to the reports that have been saved. Let's take a look at them on the right-hand side here. We'll go to library and we'll go to financials. If we go into, say, dashboards revenue, you'll notice here on the right-hand side, there's a number of reports. And one of these reports is actually this report here. And so you can select that. These are all selectable, the reports. And they're a great way to understand what filters need to be applied in order to access data. Now, I've been talking about that. Those filters include the ones in what we call the point of view, which is this here. We saw it in the flattened form. Let me close this. We saw it in the flattened form, but it pops up in the SmartView reports, and you can basically make a note of what these filters are based on the dimensions. And so that's really a good starting point for creating something very similar to this in Oracle Analytics Cloud. Now, I'll be replicating this. So when we go into Analytics Cloud, the goal is really to just recreate this with the same numbers and the same dimensions, et cetera, up in that environment. So now I will go into the OAC part of the presentation. I'm going to start by taking a look at connections, specifically the direct connection, which is typically what you would normally start off with. To do that, we'll go to data, we'll go to connections, and here's the connection here. Connection is just a URL that's the host name : port 9000 and then the EPM user ID and password. Every connection has one or more data sets associated with it. So when I go into data sets, you'll see the data set here. You can think of, in the context of EPM, a data set is a cube. So let's take a look at this data set. I'm going to open it and we'll edit the definition. So when I click edit definition, you'll see the different cubes. You'll recognize these as the ones that we looked at in EPM. The important thing to note here is that you can't edit these. You can't edit these like you would a relational table. You can't change the definitions. You can't profile the data. And so you bring it in as is. And there might be a bunch of items on here that you may not wish to to see things multilingual, multi-language columns, but you can't change that. So let's take a look at now how the visualizations would look. So if I go into a catalog, and we've got a direct connection to a data visualization report or workbook now. Let's take a look at that. And so you can see we've created a visualization off of that cube. Let's take a look at the definition. So if we expand account, you'll notice that account has a lot of columns, a lot of attributes. Many of these, probably most of these, are related to other languages. And so, and not only that, there's perhaps other columns you don't care about unrelated to the language issue, but since you can't edit this, you're going to see these all the time. And if you're doing an ad hoc report building, these can be a bit of a clutter. And the other thing I want to notice is that point out is that if I scroll down to the bottom of each dimension, you've got the hierarchy structures, which are pretty key in EPM. If I add this hierarchy column to any of the visualizations, they break it or they don't return data. So that's something just to be aware of. So I'm pulling in the columns, the generation columns here, and that sort of presents a sort of a hierarchical structure, but it's not the same. You'll notice at the top as well, I've had to put the filters in. These are the filters that you saw on the point of view in SmartView. And so I made a note of those, and then I had to create the report here. The other really important thing when you're building a report, and I'm not going to do it right in front of you here, but as you add these filters, you have to go in here and go limit values by none, because if you leave it on auto, it's going to automatically apply and run the query. And so given that you've either had previous selections, you're going to end up not seeing anything. So you need to decouple each of these from the other filters as you create and select them. Once you do that, you can select the values that you wish to create and then add your items on the canvas, and you should be good with that. Now, let me point out a few things that are important to understand about using direct connections and using DV. Is that when you use a direct connection, you can't join this data set to any other data set. It's just one of the limitations. You can't use it in a data flow. You can't use the data in building machine learning models. And you can't change the imported model, as I showed you here. You can't change that. It comes in as is. So those are important distinctions. But with a direct connection, you can actually use these hierarchies in the classic analysis view. So let's go back and take a look at that. And so we've got a direct connection with an analysis. Let's take a look at that. Now, the classic interface, it's the one that came over with OBIEE. It's been around for many, many years. It's functionally very rich, but it does require a little bit more of an understanding of how to assemble the pieces on the pages. So here it is here. I've got the account hierarchy showing here properly. I've got the period hierarchy here. I can drill down on period. I can drill down on account. You can use interesting functionality when you right click on it. You can keep only that item. You can remove that item. You can keep related, including descendants, sibling, parents, children, etc. And so you've got a lot of interesting, useful functionality in a lot of ways similar to SmartView directly in the classic view that you don't have in the DV view. Let's put aside the direct connection and look at building a BI model. This will allow us to overcome some of these limitations. So before you start working with the BI admin tool, of course, you need to install it and configure it to access the planning cube. I'll include some link to some instructions on how to install and configure that, and I won't cover that in detail today. Follow those instructions, but very briefly, you do need to download and install the JDK Java. And then you need to set some environment variables. So if you go in here and all I do is type system to access that. Once you access the system panel, go to advanced system settings here and then go to environment variables. And if you go into the system variables, you'll notice a couple of ones that Java Home needs to be set based on where you installed it. You'll need to edit the path statement here and add the Java Home right here. And I believe that's pretty much it. After that, download from the internet. You can download the admin client tool. It's Windows only. We'll be coming out with a cloud-based version later this year, but download and install that. It's very simple, straightforward download. And then you do need to go into here and into the admin tool command and edit and add a instance name in this file here. And then you need to start the Java host. Now, to be clear, the Java host is only required to import the metadata. Once the metadata has been imported from the planning cube, you actually don't need this running. You can stop it. And that's the start on client.bat. Note the path. It depends on where you installed it. I just took the defaults. It installed it under C, Oracle Middleware, Oracle Home BI, etc. You can see the path there. You start the process. If it is not running, you cannot import the metadata. So that's just important. And it's a one-time only. You can actually build out more, you can actually update and make changes to the cube after, to be clear, make changes to the metadata in the BI repository from the cube. You can make changes to that without having this running, but to initially import it, you do need it running. So let's take a look at that. Let's start the BI admin tool. I've installed it. I'll start it up here. And then let's open it up, file open. Now I already have one built out here, but I'll show you the import process. It's password protected. You create a new repository and then give it a password. And all you do is right click new database and make sure it's a planning, Hyperion planning database. Properties, we'll show you that here, Hyperion planning, okay, set it there. Then you need a connection pool. We created a connection pool, and that's this here. You create a connection pool. And let's take a look at the properties. You need this URL again. I'll provide a link to some documentation that will help you set this up. And then you'll need your planning user ID and your planning password. And once you've done that, you just right click import metadata and you should immediately see this come up here. And then you'll see the cubes. These are the ones that we looked at in the planning application, right? This is and we're focused on the OEPFS cube. You just select that, copy it over. It will bring it in. And you'll end up with something here. And then we can move on to building out the remaining metadata, which is something you need to do. Super simple, but you need to take it from here. And at this point, once you've imported the metadata on the physical side, you can actually shut down the Java host. You don't need to start it anymore. And you don't need to have it running to make any of the changes that we're going to discuss shortly on how to set up the cube for access. All right, let's get started taking a look at modeling in an RPD using the BI administration tool. After bringing in the model and importing the metadata from the cube, you need to create the model, the business model in the modeling and mapping layer, and then also then create a presentation layer. This is very, very simple. You just take the model that you created and imported here, the metadata. Let's take a look at that. You notice it looks very similar to the direct connection. It's brought in the metadata from the cube. It's also got a lot of these columns, which we talked about earlier, as having little value in most cases for those who don't really care about multilingual support and all these other columns. So one thing you can do is once you drag these models into the presentation layer, you can modify them. And that's not something you can do in a data set that's been imported on the DV side. So for example, if you open up the account dimension here, you notice that I've deleted 90% of the columns. They're not of any interest to me. This means that when you create reports and you edit reports, you don't need to be navigating through these large number of columns that you probably don't care about. So it really cleans things up. Once you drag that model into the modeling layer, it creates it for you automatically. You don't need to do anything other than dragging it in. And then once you've done that, you drag it into the presentation layer, and that's it. So very, very simple. Then you just need to upload it and replace the data model in the OAC instance, and you're good to go. I do want to cover a few other things that you might want to consider doing to improve access, possibly offer some features and simplifications that you don't get if you just drag it over. So what we've done here is I've deleted columns. So that's one immediate step you can do to simplify things. I then took this column and I simply duplicated it into this second subject area. Now, why would I want to do that? The hierarchies that are created by default are parent-child hierarchies. That really reflects the same experience you have in SmartView. But if you create a level-based hierarchy, you can then directly access levels in that hierarchy and name those levels. And that just gives you another option. If you want to go to a certain level using parent-child, you have to drill down to it. There's no kind of direct access to it. And so the level-based hierarchy does offer that as a benefit. Even though it's level-based, those hierarchies can still be ragged. So it'll look and feel very similar to the parent-child versions. It's just that they'll have levels that are potentially named if you want to change the default name. So let's take a look at that. Let me collapse this model here. I'm going to expand this. Now let's take a look at the account dimension. I created this. I created it manually, and I'll show you how to do that. But it's got the different generations now, and you can navigate through these levels, and you can rename them as well. I've just taken the default name here, account gen 1, 2, 3, etc. And so let's take a look at that. I'm going to delete this. So you would have to delete the existing one because you can't have multiple hierarchies on a dimension. So let me do that. Right click, delete. And then when you go down to account here, you just right click, create logical dimension, create dimension with level-based hierarchy. And then when you do that, it's going to put everything in a detailed level. There it is there. It's all in the detail level. Now, how do I create the hierarchy? Just right click on it and say parent level. And I would say level gen 9. And then you can create another parent off that, new object parent level, and you can see child level as well. Level gen 8 and so forth. Once you've created the levels, all you do is drag the items into level 9. And so there's a name and an alias in level 9. And then we can do similarly the same thing for level 8. Grab the name, grab the alias and name. And you'll also notice there's a sort order. when I created this initially, I put the sort orders in there and I had all the levels controlled with that sort order column. It turned out that creating the cube was creating a report on that model was very, very slow. So I removed those sort orders. It dramatically increased the speed, but I maintained still the sort order on the period dimension because the period names January, February, March were not coming up in the right order. So the really nice thing about modeling among dozens and dozens of other things in this modeling tool is you can control sort orders on any given column. And so we maintained the sort order on the period column, didn't really slow things down much at all. And selectively, you can do that for any of the others where you need to. So that's great. Then you publish this, you literally finish that, you drag it over here, make it available. And so that's another option. And you can maintain both at the same time, and they're both accessing data in the cube on the fly dynamically. And you've got different navigation options with each of those. Now, one more thing I did is that you recall that I talked about the need to create filters on all the different dimensions, similar to what you have to do in SmartView with a point of view. And so that can be a little tedious. And so a way to get around that is to put those filters directly in the model at the data level. Let me show you how that looks. So if I drill down on the measure itself, what you do is you open the sources, you right click, you hit properties, and then go to the content tab. And this will already be in there, the different dimensions defaulted to the detail level. But you go down into the where clause, and here's where you can put the filter in. And you can see there, you recall years were set to FY21, scenario to OAP plan, and currency, etc. Now, this was done for the revenue cube. You could create a subject area, multiple subject areas, each one set to the filters that you need for those different subject areas. So that really simplifies things. I'll show you when we go to create a report how much simpler it is to go against a focused revenue subject area so that we don't have to put these filters in. Now, having put them in, you can't get around that. You can't sort of remove those filters and reuse it for something else. These are behind the scenes. They're in the modeling layer. Once the model is applied, you can't sort of deselect that filter, but you can always maintain a master subject area that has no filters and put them in at the report level, or create additional subject areas to make it simpler. Now, there's much, much more you can do in the modeling tool. This isn't intended to be like an exhaustive presentation of BI modeling, but it does give you some pointers on how to make access to the EPBCS cubes much easier. There's only one other thing I want to sort of point out here is that I've got this other subject area in here as well. I've added a detailed table that I want to drill out to in the from a cube out to relational data. This is actually not EPBCS, it's a Oracle database. And you can see that here, the connection pool. I right click. When I go to properties, you'll see that it's an Oracle data source right there. And so, you can model other subject areas here against other Oracle and non-Oracle databases. If I say new database, you'll see here that there's really a very broad range of types of data, including even big data and unstructured data, where you can create connections and create models on top of them. Again, this isn't intended to be an exhaustive explanation of how to use and how to create BI models, but it does give you some pointers on how to pretty simply do that with a cube. So after you've made changes to your model, before you post it and publish it up to OAC, you do need to validate it. You simply go into the file, check global consistency, go report only. There is going to be a warning since we had changed the database features. That's just a warning, but other than that, you should be good to go. So this means that you don't need to worry about publishing a model that's going to be broken or isn't valid. That the consistency checker identifies any potential errors and fixes that for you. So now we have the model, we need to publish it and up to OAC. And to do that, we're going to go in here, we're going to go to the console. So we'll go into snapshots. And in snapshots on the upper left here, you'll see a menu and it'll say replace data model. Select that. You can ignore this configure virus scanner, proceed without a virus scanner, select the file. I've got mine in downloads, select it here, open. The only other thing you need is the password to the RPD, which we set when we created it. You enter that and then hit replace. I won't do that, but that upload should only take a few seconds. Be aware that after the model is uploaded, there is also another 2 or 3 minutes that you should wait before the model actually gets recognized by the BI server. So take 5 minutes, like replace the data model, let it upload, take 2 or 3, 4 minutes, then you can go back in and immediately start, after that, immediately start using and building reports on top of the data model. So now let's go to the final bit where we take a look at the reports that I created on top of the BI model that was done in Classic, that is the RPD. And we'll start first with a data visualization report. Recall that the DV reports created off direct connections. I couldn't use the hierarchies. I could create reports to show everything else, but the hierarchy navigation wasn't there. You can create DV reports against the hierarchies that are level-based. So let's take a look at that. And the one that we'll take a look at is the DV flat income statement. So that's this one here. And so, yeah, this is the level-based hierarchy. I called it OEPFS flat. And you can see that the dimension, the account dimension and all the other dimensions, they show the different levels separately. You don't have to navigate to them and drill down to them. You can go directly to them. And you'll see here that it looks very similar to the other one. As you drill down, even though they're levels, they still look and behave like parent-child hierarchies. And of course, when you do that, when you create your reports, this presentation isn't focused at showing all the visualization capabilities of DV, but obviously, if you can create a cross tab, you should be able to use these different elements in other visualizations that might be more interesting. So that's just some examples there. So let's move on, and we're going to go take a look at RPD analysis balance sheet. Go back, don't save, to the catalog. We'll go to here. And this is going to look a lot more similar and close to income statements, balance sheets, financial statements that you're used to creating in SmartView. I replicated this. It does use the native hierarchy, parent-child hierarchy. It's coming from the classic RPD, and you can drill on it just like everything else. You can drill on it, and yeah, that's very basic. We still need to have these filters. Recall we had them on the DV side up on the page items. I've added this one here directly on the report, but with BI, you have independent control over whether you see the filters, the pivot table, the titles. You can have multiple titles. You can even have add to it. You can even add the selection steps to it as well. So all of these things in addition to the nice looking visualizations, there are other things like filter, views, selection steps, and yeah, you can add them and move them around. I've showed them here just for transparency, but in a report you may wish to not show that. So let's take a look at an analysis income statement. It is similar to the balance sheet. There are some differences I'd like to show you. First and foremost, I'd like to show that you can drill out, you can add links. So if I want to go out to product detail, I pre-created product detail and created a live link out to it. It's a named link. You can have multiple links here. It can be external websites as well, and it can be contextual. So when I click to drill out to revenue, of course, I pre-created this, and I can drill across both axes. So that's really, really helpful. Let's go back. Now, what if I wanted to drill in place and add the item here? So let me show you something else. We'll go into edit mode. And in edit mode, what we'll do is we'll go down to the product dimension here. And instead of just adding the dimension hierarchy as is, I'm going to drill down into it. And then I'll add the drilled item so that we don't have to kind of drill down these top 3 levels. So let me add that on there. There it is there. And if you don't want that to be showing all the time, let's edit this. And we'll drag this item product into the excluded column, which is there. Let's save it. And we'll go back into the report as an end user. Here it is here. And at this point, we can now go include column product. And instead of being at the top of the hierarchy, we've added it partway through. And you can see that if we go and we add a selector view, you can see that that automatically saved those selections. So if we go here, we go to selection steps and we say done, and then we add the selection steps to the report, we can see why it is that we get to navigate directly from that point in which I added it. It says start with total revenue, add cost of sales, start with product. So you can see that there. So this is all getting dynamically updated. We don't normally view this. We don't normally have it on the report, but it's a nice way to see what's going on. And you can certainly have it optionally added if you want. So the next one that I want to show you is just the fact that we can add these into dashboards. So we'll go into a Vision Corp dashboard, and I've assembled those 2 reports onto the dashboard. We've got pages across the top, and each page can have multiple visualizations, and each visualization can be compound visualization, so it could have multiple reports. So you can see that you can assemble all these pieces into some pretty comprehensive and good looking dashboards and have navigations between them pretty easily. A little different methodology than with DV, but also it has more flexibility because all of these components on these visualizations are independently controlled. So one more thing, a couple more things before we close on this. The next thing I want to show is the fact that we can now join this to other data sets. So I brought in a data set, a detailed transactional data set. So imagine you've got a cube and you've got an account balance and you want to see the transactions from that. We're going to open one called EPMRV-DV join, and that's here. And this one joins a data set that I uploaded, which is transactional with the other data. And so this measure column is data that I generated for the purposes of showing you this. So this is coming from a relational structured format, row, column, not from a cube. all of these are coming from a cube. And so you've joined on account, product, and period. Obviously, you need to have the data sets joined with all the dimensions joined appropriately. And once you do that, you can see where that is. And you can see the join here in the right here. There's the joins, join on account to account, currency to currency, entity to entity, etc. So that's kind of a nice way to combine data from different sources to the cube data, which is obviously something that a lot of folks would want to do. Now, the very last thing I'm going to show you is how easy it is to create a report when we've already added the filters. So let's go back here. Don't save that. I'm going to go create. I'm going to actually navigate to the classic side, open the classic home, and we're going to go create analysis. The subject area is revenue. This is the one, recall, I put the filters on, and I'm going to go in here and I will add the account hierarchy. I'm going to add period name to it, and I'll create I'll grab one of the measure here. Notice I have no filters. And we just need to go down to selection steps. We can go do that here. We go to account, and we'll go to financial accounts, revenue planning, and gross profit. Okay, and bang, you've got the data here. And then at this point, you can start to drill down. I'm going to change this into a pivot table. This is a pivot table. Let me modify this. I'll put the period up into here. And now it looks very much like the previous one. There's one more thing I want to touch on. You recall I talked about the need to add these filters on data visualization as well as classic reports. I also talked about a way around that, whereby you can create subject areas with those filters in the data model, and that's really convenient. There's one other technique I'd like to share with you so that you can consider this as an alternative and simplification to the process of adding all of these one by one. So when you run a report like this, it actually generates a query to the BI server, and that query can be accessed through the console. You go into the console here, you go into session and query cache, and you'll see the query generated down here. And I generated this recently. To access this query, and from the log, you just go into the logging session and query cache screen, and then just go view log. And you don't need to concern yourself with all of the stuff here. It generates a lot of information, even for a single query. But you'll see the query is actually here, select, and you'll see the columns from the subject area. And then the key thing is this predicate, this where clause. And these are the filters. And so you can say, well, how can I use that? And the answer is, you can do that. You can enter that filter as an expression filter, and it's one dialog box that you can paste the filter into that. And if you've saved it for revenue, you could save a revenue filter. You could save a balance sheet filter. For each subject area, you could have a separate filter available and saved in a separate text panel on the dashboard or somewhere else. But so if I go in here and I go, let's get out of here. Let's create a new report, workbook. I'm going to select the subject area, and I'm going to select this subject area. And you can construct these filters yourself manually, but it's just easier to pick them up off the log. And so first, I will add the expression filter here. Instead of picking a column, go to add expression filter. You can name it or change the label. And so I've got a formatted version of that filter, validate it, calculation validate it, apply it. So now this one box has all the filters for all of the other areas, including the hierarchies, which aren't up here. So I'm going to decouple for a moment, stop the query. I'm going to add the items, and then I'll reapply the query execution. So let's go to the account. Let's go to the account hierarchy. Now recall this flat version is a level based, and you can select just the hierarchy and add it, but then you have to drill down 3 or 4 levels before you get to the data. So I know that it's in Gen 4. So I know that it's the 4th level. So I'm going to directly access that. And on the period dimension hierarchy, I know that the period is actually in the detail column there. And I'm going to change this to crosstab. I'll put the period as columns. And the last thing is I need the measure. Let me grab the measure and go to the value, add that into values. And now I'll turn the query back on. And what it's doing is it's applying all these filters that I would otherwise have had to do myself. You'll see that here. Just click on all these filters are there, and you can read it. So go to gross profit, and now we can drill back down, and you can enter at whatever level you wish by selecting that level and filtering appropriately for all of those items. Now, the syntax for some of this filters, I want to point out, a lot of it's fairly straightforward. You can year's name equals 21, scenario name, but there's a couple of interesting things here, and these are hierarchical navigational elements, and that's the ID of, and then you can select, let's take a look at the documentation on that. So here's the documentation on these interesting hierarchical navigational functions. And so if we go to, let's go down here. There's the ID of, it's the returns a representation of the member key columns for a given member in a parent-child hierarchy. But there's other interesting ones, such as, is it the ancestor, is it give me back the children of a parent, and that's this one, and give me back the descendants. And so there's a lot of interesting functions that we can use to directly select members in a parent-child or level-based hierarchy. And they're under this hierarchy navigation functions. And here they are here, depth, ancestor, children, descendants is leaf, parent is root. And you'll see this generated in the queries as well. I found it easier to simply create one manually and then use that as a guide to create the filters manually and then save them somewhere and apply them selectively. So that's an alternative to simplifying the filtering, an alternative to building a separate model for every kind of combination that you want to work with. Hope that's you found that useful.